So, starting with part 5 of the review, we're going to be looking at material from after the midterm. Now, obviously, we know that the material that we covered after the midterm is going to make up the bulk of the final, with the multiple choice and fill in the blank being drawn entirely from material that we covered after the midterm. Obviously, the other two parts, the true, false, and the short answers, will include material from after the midterm. It will just also include material from before the midterm. So, the first thing we looked at was the media. The media is actually a really good bridge between our institutions of government and our discussion of politics, right? Because the media can actually be considered a part of the government, almost a fourth branch of the government, if you will, because the media and the government are so intertwined in so many ways, right? The press, the news media specifically, right? The organizations that package and deliver the news actually really check the government, right? We saw that with the Pentagon Papers, for example. This revealed quite a bit about the Nixon administration, as well as many prior administrations, but then Nixon's reaction to it and the subsequent Watergate hotel break-in and all of that then eventually led to Nixon's resignation, right? It wasn't specifically the Pentagon Papers, but that did sort of start the chain of events that ultimately led to Nixon's resignation. So the press can be a very strong check on the government. And because of this, the relationship between the press and the government is very odd, right? The press can keep the government in check. Much of what the news media does is report on the government, and by reporting on the government, I typically mean critically, right? The press isn't just going to always report, oh, the government's amazing, what a great day. Everyone in the government is great and doing everything perfectly exactly the way we in the public want it, right? That's not not very realistic news report. The press wants to ferret out incompetence, malfeasance, corruption, anything like that, right? Report on that because that's really newsworthy. And it is also their responsibility as a major check on the political branches and to an extent on the court, but much less so. And this makes them not necessarily particularly friendly with the government, right? People in the government don't necessarily love the press. Press is kind of the enemy in many ways. Except the government also needs the press. There's an old public relations adage, all publicity is good publicity, right? Just getting your name out there is good. Doesn't matter if the story about you is bad, your name's out there, right? So the government needs the press. Also, if the press were to disappear, who would cover the government? How would the public know what the government was doing? The government needs the press. So the government can't just shut out the press entirely because they don't like press coverage. Now, the press also can't always be adversarial towards the government, right? Because they need the government. What if the government just shut out the press? The press would have nothing to cover. Obviously at the beginning it would be, oh my God, the government shut out the press. But then after a while, that's not news anymore. So the press would have nothing to do. So they both need each other. The press needs to be able to cover the government, so they need access to the government. They need access to politicians. But the government also needs the press because the government needs this coverage. They need the press to have access because without access, there's no coverage, right? And also the government will from time to time use the press to leak stories. Sometimes these might be inoculating leaks. Sometimes these might be trial balloons, right, where they maybe test a policy. An unnamed government source talks about Trump's administration proposing X policy, and if the public's like, oh, this X policy sounds great, maybe the administration does it. Or if the public's like, ooh, this policy doesn't sound very good, maybe they don't, right? So the government can use the press to test things and to maybe leak some damaging information, inoculating leaks, to sort of get the public aware of it so that when it all comes out and blows up, it's not as big of a deal. The public already kind of knew, right? So they need each other, but they're also adversaries. The press is always looking to trip up the government's always looking to fool the press. But the press needs access, so they can't always be horrible about the government. And the government needs favorable press coverage, so they can't always be horrible to the press. Right? So you could say that this is a bit of a prisoner's dilemma. And there isn't really any sort of outside enforcement, any sort of institution keeping them cooperating, except perhaps, in this case, the public, right? The press and the government both need access to us. They both need us, the public, to pay attention. So that might be, at the end of the day, what sort of keeps them cooperating, keeps them coming back. Now, we know the media started out as the party press, right? So it wasn't always so adversarial. Back in the early days of the press, it was expensive to print papers, so papers were generally completely funded by the political parties. But that wasn't a great business model for reporters, right? Because if a party did badly in an election, they might try to overhaul the paper. They might also stop having enough money to pay for everyone. So as soon as printing presses became a lot cheaper and easier, the press broke away from political parties and moved towards a corporate model. Right? This did change how press covered politics. The press wasn't extremely biased towards whatever party was funding them, but on the other hand, the press kind of stopped covering politics as much. It's not to say they don't still cover politics, obviously they do, but they started covering a lot of other things as well. We saw that in the early days, things like the penny press, which was much more about entertainment than it was about politics. We still see that today if you watch the nightly news. There's always these sort of feel-good segments. NBC Nightly News does the Making a Difference specials, right? And it's always like one news piece about someone who's doing a nice thing. Not exactly political news. Sometimes it overlaps with politics, but not always, right? So the corporate model is different. They're trying to attract viewers, and viewers don't always want to see politics. Still, though, the media does have a lot of power within politics, right? They can frame a story for us, and that they can tell us, basically, what to consider when we think about a story. So we saw that with the Hertzberg article and the discussion of different language used about entitlements, right? But there are other classic examples of this. For example, if you frame an issue of, say, a political protest, if the news media talks about it in terms of people exercising their their First Amendment right of assembly and speech to protest a government action, probably people are going to look pretty favorably on that, right? They framed it in a way that triggers us to think about things like the First Amendment, which we generally approve of. But what if they framed it in a negative light? These protesters are becoming increasingly violent, attacking passersby. Suddenly, we don't care about their First Amendment rights. We don't like violence. And you can see this even a bit with the discussions a few years back on Occupy Wall Street, right? At the beginning, it was mass protests, protesting government policy and inequality and, fighting for the 99%. But it slowly became sort of, idiots camped out on Wall Street disrupting traffic. People just out there camping, not even knowing what they really want anymore. Is that really what was happening with the Occupy movement? Maybe. But certainly the framing of it changed our perception of what was happening. Unless we were actually able to go there and see it for ourselves, we had to take the media's word for it. And their frames really impacted how we felt about the movements. Agenda setting's a little different, right? That's not telling us how to think about a story. That's telling us what to think about at all, right? So we saw this a lot during the 2016 political campaigns, right? Presidential campaigns. The media kept talking about Clinton's emails. The media kept talking about Trump's sexist comments. So that contest became very much about sort of Trump's gaffes and sexism and Clinton's emails and those servers. Were those the only issues of the campaign? Clearly not. But because the media kept talking about them, that was sort of the agenda that was set for the campaign. That's certainly what we really think about when we think back to the campaign, right? So the media has a lot of power to tell us how to think about a story and what to think about it all. And they are protected by the First Amendment, right? It is very hard as a public figure, so a politician, say, to sue the media for libel. Because you have to prove actual malice, right? As a private figure, if say the New York Post, and I pick on them, but it seems like it could happen. Say one of you went to the New York Post and said, I have this professor at Baruch who hit a student in class. I never hit a student in class, but you say I did. And they run with it. I, as a private person, could sue them for libel and probably win because obviously they didn't do sort of their journalistic due diligence and follow up the story and find out that that was not in fact the case. If they talked to any of your classmates, they might have found out, yeah, she never hit anyone, but that kid failed the class. So, they're probably just upset about it, right? They would have found that out, probably not run the story. But what if in 10 years I'm running for office and you go to the Post and you say, hey, this woman who's running for political office was actually my professor back in the day and she hit a student in class. Still, the story is not true. Still, they might be running it without doing their due diligence. But now I have to prove actual malice because as a public figure running for office, I no longer just have the bar of trying to prove that they didn't do the right thing from a journalistic standpoint and check the story and see if it was true. Now, even though it's a falsehood that they're publishing about me, I have to prove that they published that with actual malice, meaning complete disregard for journalistic norms, knowledge that it was false, so a disregard for journalistic norms, and a desire to use it to hurt me, or my campaign in that case, right? So that is a much higher bar to clear. Yeah, I might be able to prove that they didn't do their best journalistically and that they probably knew it was false. I mean, on its face, it sounds pretty false. But unless I can prove that they did it with malice, basically, with the intent to hurt my campaign, and not just the intent to inform the public about something that might be pertinent to my campaign, if I can't prove that there was malice involved in that publication and not just desire to tell the public something that is relevant to a campaign, I'm not going to be able to prove libel. So it's very hard for a public official to prove libel. This really protects newspapers. And the idea is you don't want newspapers being so scared to publish something critical about a politician that they no longer publish even things they believe or know to be true, right? You don't want to silence the truth, so we might have to put up with some falsehoods. Now, another way that the media is protected is with limits on prior restraint, right? The government can't just stop the media from publishing something. Really, the only occasion they can is with the troopship exception. So danger to our troops or occasionally national security, right? If you publish this, say troop movements, which is where the troopship exception came from, the troops will be in danger, right? For the most part, the media is willing to buy the government's claims of national security and hold off on publication until a better time. But sometimes the government tries to use it in cases where the media doesn't believe national security is at stake. These cases sometimes end up in the court, like the Pentagon Papers case. In the Pentagon Papers case, the government tried to stop the Washington Post and the New York Times from publishing the Pentagon Papers, saying that it endangered national security and our troops abroad. And the court rejected this argument. They said that no, publishing things that make the government look bad is not the same thing as endangering security, and allowed the publication of the Pentagon Papers to continue. Now, the media is one of the major factors of socialization, right? So when we, in the public, go to vote, we have different sort of things that we bring to it. We are socialized to consider things in certain ways. And those, the ways we are socialized are through our family, our school, our peers, work, and the media. And family, being the first, is also the best and strongest factor of socialization, right? That is the thing that shapes us the most. Right? We are shaped into who we are by how we are raised. Certainly, our schools have some influence on us as well. Our peers, our peer groups, right, who we choose to hang out with, can certainly impact how we think, and what sort of factors we bring to bear on our political decisions. Our workplace, right, our peers in the workplace, but also the type of work we choose to do. And then obviously the media. So let me explain each of those a little bit more. Right, our family might be conservative, so they're probably going to raise us with conservative ideals, right? Or they might be liberal and raise us with those. And alternatively, we could talk about it from a partisan standpoint. If we come from a family of Republicans, we're probably pretty likely to grow up thinking we're going to vote for Republicans, right? So you can see our family, as we talk about any sort of issue, can socialize us to think certain ways about issues and politics. Our school, similar thing. But also, we can think about socialization as just even how we would consider turning out to vote, right? Our family, if our parents go to vote all the time and maybe take us to vote, we might be more likely to think voting is important. If you have teachers in grade school or professors in college who tell you that voting is important and that the way you can impact your government and therefore your life is to vote, maybe you go and vote. Our peers, our peer groups, what issues they encounter. If we're friends with a lot of people who are immigrants, we might start to view immigration differently, right? And then from a turnout standpoint, if all our peers vote and our peers are saying to, and we don't vote, you don't vote, and then suddenly you say, oh, I hate this thing the government's done. They're like, well, maybe you should vote next time, right? And enough of that sort of peer pressure may socialize you to think voting is important. In our workplace, right, we may really change how we feel about certain issues depending on where we work. Let's say you decide to go to law school and you want to go and do public service law, right? Be a prosecutor, or maybe be a public defender, because everyone deserves a defense, right? But then you have $100,000 in loans from law school, and you'd really like to be able to pay them off. So you decide to go be a corporate attorney and earn a lot of money. And even though through all of law school you thought, oh, that is scummy, those lawyers are sellouts, I hate that, I'm going to do the right thing with my law degree. But now you're doing this because it's what you need to do. Are you going to still think that corporate attorneys are scum? And that the only good attorneys are the ones who are doing public service law? Probably not, right? Because you don't want to think of yourself as scum. That's a cognitive dissonance that your brain is not going to be happy with. So you're going to reevaluate how you feel about different types of law. Maybe how you feel about policies towards corporations, right? And that might change how you view the government even. How you view different corporate laws about corporations, right? Corporate policy. And certainly the media can shape how you view things as well. So Looking at voter behavior from a demographic standpoint, right, what predicts turnout? Well, age, education, and money. Older people are much more likely to vote. That's partially because they've had sort of more years to learn about politics, so it takes a lot less effort for them. Partially because older people tend to have more of a stake in politics. Um, you're more likely to own a home, right? So you're more likely to want to vote because home ownership is very entwined with government things like tax policy and land use laws, even. So you're more likely to have a stake in things. Uh, Education, those who are more highly educated are more likely to vote. Possibly because school socializes you to think that this is important. Possibly because school just gives you the tools you need to know what to do when you're going and voting, right? Money, the wealthier you are, the more likely you are to vote. Part of that may be because you have more of a stake in the policy. If you have more money, you have a lot more interest in tax policy, probably. Also, more money tends to come with jobs that are more likely to also have a stake in government policy, or you're more likely to see that stake in government policy. In addition, obviously, people with more money are older and usually more highly educated. But even controlling for those two, money does play a role. Some of that is people with money tend to come from families with money. So your family may be more likely to socialize you that voting is important. And those older members of your family may be doing it because they have a stake in the policy. But you don't necessarily know that when you're 18 and going out to vote for the first time. But if you've always been told you should vote, more likely to. Also, if you are poorer, you're more likely to be working as a shift laborer, right? As an hourly laborer, someone who is paid by the hour, not salaried. So you might not be able to get time off to vote. So we can see that money can play a number of different roles in that. Interestingly, gender is not a good predictor of turnout. Women are very slightly more likely to vote, but it's not a major factor at all. Men and women basically vote at the same rates when you control for factors like age, education, and money. Now, people are cognitive misers, right? We are rationally ignorant. Why learn more than you need to learn? If you know you agree with the Democratic Party on several key points, or you agree with the Republican Party on several key points, do you really need to know what every Democrat on the ballot or every Republican on the ballot stands for? Do you need to know what the guy who's running for city comptroller thinks? Do you need to know what the woman who's running for county executive thinks? Probably not. So long as you know what party they're in and you have some idea which party you associate yourself with, that's probably enough. So when we say that people are really unaware about politics, we tend to say it as a very critical statement, but actually it's very logical and rational to be ignorant about politics, because unless you're someone like me who studies it, you don't really get much of a benefit from knowing more, so why know more? And obviously this ties in with our idea of party cues, right? If you know your party, you basically know how you're going to vote. So if it's a partisan election, like most general elections, though not judicial elections, right, federal judges are not elected, but state and local judges can be. But most elections have party cues, right? Primary elections don't, nor do nonpartisan elections. So if you don't know a lot other than your party, you're much more likely to vote in a general election than in a primary election, because in a primary election, there's no party cue. You can go in and say, I'm a Democrat, I'm going to vote in the Democratic primary, or I'm a Republican, I'm going to vote in the Republican primary. But past that, all the people on the ballot are from your party, so you're going to need to know more about them. Now, retrospective voting is a different way of choosing who you're going to vote for. Party cues are definitely the strongest influence on voting. If you could only ask someone one question, it is actually more reliable to ask them one question in order to predict who they're going to vote for. it is more reliable to ask them their party than to ask them who they're going to vote for, right? Especially when we look at lower offices. Who are you going to vote for Congress in your district in 2020? You might not know even who's on the ballot, but you probably know which party candidate you're going to vote for. So party cues are incredibly good predictors of voter behavior. But retrospective voting is certainly another way people vote, right? They look back at a candidate's past performance and they say, do I like what they've done? Yes, okay, I'll vote for them. Do I not like what they've done? Okay, then I'll vote against them, right? So retrospective voting just means looking back at someone's record. If they're running for office an office that they haven't held, you might look back at their record in another office. This is certainly in 2020 what will happen with Biden, right? It's not that, Biden isn't president right now, so we can't use retrospective voting. People would certainly look back at his record as vice president and in various other offices and just generally his behavior in life. People will certainly do the same thing with Trump. How has Trump been over the past 4 years? And vote accordingly. Now, we know that turnout rates are not particularly high in the US, but we actually know that they're kind of higher than you would expect because voting is incredibly irrational if you look at it purely as a utility function, right? You get almost nothing out of voting. Your vote is almost never going to be decisive. So you could just free ride off the people who do schlep to the polls and wait online and bother voting. You could be free rider really easily. You still get the benefits of the election, but you don't have to bother voting. So, and we know that the costs, right, of voting are high, but again, the benefits are low. So, turnout rates should actually probably be lower than they are. Why aren't they so low? Well, first of all, that first vote cast is decisive. The second vote cast, if it's cast for the other party, goes from a landslide to a dead heat, right? So when we say one vote doesn't matter, it almost never does. On very rare occasions it does, like that article I gave you about that one election that was decided by one vote. For the most part, even though your one vote is not decisive, it does still matter that you voted, because if everyone thought that their vote wasn't going to be decisive, no one ever would vote, and then that single vote cast would be decisive. Also, some people get sort of some personal pleasure out of it, right? People who are socialized to think voting is important may actually get sort of a kick out of voting. People whose peers tease them for complaining about the government when they don't vote are probably going to vote because it helps them in their peer group. Right? So there are sort of personal benefits depending on your situation that might help. You may also have a stake in the campaign, whether it's in the policies the candidate is promising, or maybe you've donated or volunteered to that campaign, so now you've sort of bought in and you want them to win. So now voting has a much higher payoff because it's sort of helping you realize your buy-in. How can we improve voter turnout? That one I'm going to say go back to the slides on voter behavior. I have some suggestions on there. I believe we also had a discussion on that, and there were some good suggestions. So obviously, voting is based on opinion, right? You vote based on your opinion on a candidate. Now, candidates and the government generally do need to understand public opinion as a whole. Each individual's opinion doesn't necessarily matter to a politician, but public opinion of the public in aggregate, is very important to politicians. So how is that opinion formed, right? You can certainly go back to the slides and look at it in more depth, but we know it's formed often through reactions to events and based on our own personal socialization and our own partisan lens on things. But there's a lot more on the slides on public opinion about this. Now, how do we measure public opinion? Mainly with surveys or polling, right? But surveys and polling aren't perfect. They're actually quite challenging to use and interpret properly. Why? Well, because we can't ask everyone the question. You can't say, I wonder how Americans feel about, I don't know, gun control, and go out and ask every single American, right? It's not going to happen. So you need to select a sample. And even the best random sample may not be perfect, right? Random digit dialing, for example, which used to be sort of the gold standard of getting a random sample, only reaches landlines. Who tends to have and answer landline phones? Do you have a landline phone that you answer? Probably not. Do your parents? Maybe. Do your grandparents? Most likely, right? So older people are more likely to have and answer a landline phone than younger people, which means that a seemingly random sample isn't all that random after all. So pollsters have ways of correcting for this, right? They know the demographics of America as a whole, and they know the demographics of the people they've surveyed, and they try to weight their surveys appropriately to sort of account for some of this error in the random selection. But it doesn't always work perfectly. Also, questions can be framed in ways to elicit certain responses. Obviously, we know push polls can take advantage of this. Push polls actually are trying to get a specific answer out of people. But even a legitimate poll can accidentally fall into this trap. And Pew Research did a really interesting experiment on this a while back when, before same-sex marriage was legalized, and the big debate was over whether we should even legalize civil unions, right? Some sort of less than marriage option. And they took two separate samples and asked them these questions in a different order. The first sample they asked said, do you support domestic partnerships? Or civil unions, I believe they called them. Do you support same-sex marriage? And the results were what they were. But when you asked the questions in the other order, asking about marriage before civil unions, support for civil unions went way up. And they concluded that it was probably because the order framed people to actually think, well, civil unions are better than same-sex marriage, I guess, so sure, I support those. They seem much more reasonable now. So the order of the questions, the way the questions are worded, can frame people to make certain responses, even in a legitimate poll where there's no intention to frame people to give certain responses. It can happen. There was a poll done a while back that actually found that people answer questions about the Affordable Care Act differently than they answer questions about Obamacare. Obamacare has a lower approval rating than the Affordable Care Act. Obamacare is just another name for the Affordable Care Act, right? But by calling it Obamacare, it framed the question presumably to elicit responses based on people's feelings towards Obama rather than towards the Affordable Care Act. So framing can really change how public opinion looks because we've measured it differently we've measured a different thing than we think we've measured. Also, public opinion is unstable. A lot of people don't have opinions on a lot of issues, right? We're cognitive misers. We're rationally ignorant. So sometimes if you're asked a polling question, you don't necessarily want to admit you don't know, but you might not really have a clear answer. So that makes public opinion very unstable. It's hard to measure opinion if an opinion doesn't exist. That said, if everyone sort of guesses on an answer, that error usually cancels itself out, right? About the same amount of people will say, on a scale of 1 to 5, probably as many people will guess 1 as will guess 5, right? So those errors tend to cancel out. So we know aggregate public opinion is still relatively stable, even if individual public opinion is not. So when we see big changes in aggregate public opinion, we know something is going on. So public opinion, right? Voter behavior, the media, these are all clearly very related and entwined concepts. and all of them help determine how politicians are going to end up behaving.